name is Braden Hill, and this is my persuasive presentation for Communication 2400. And I chose to do mine on why the Second Amendment is still relevant in modern day America. So, my next slide, this is basically what you see in this picture, your basic AR-15 of the modern day, and we live in one of the few countries where you're still actually allowed to legally own one of these. Countries where you're not allowed to would be something like Cuba, China, any of those communist countries. So there's some parallels there with freedoms and gun ownership. Which brings me to my first slide. This quote here is from Aristotle's The Republic. As of oligarchy, so of tyranny, both mistrust the people and therefore deprive them of their arms. Which is saying, as long as you control the means to defend, as long as you control the people's means to defend themselves, you can basically do whatever you want, because they're not going to be able to stand up to anything that you do. Which is what this next bullet point here emphasizes. A lot of these countries, like China and Cuba, they terrorize their people and do whatever they want, and they have no way of retaliating, because it's illegal to own things like these. So, a lot of people will try to argue that the Second Amendment only applies to well-regulated militias, but that is where the National Guard, the State National Guard, the Federal National Guard come into play. But the Second Amendment is intended for citizens to actually own guns themselves. Back in the 1700s, there was no National Guard for the colonies. Pretty much every household owned a gun, and that's what allowed us to really gain our freedom from Great Britain. It was just a way of life. If we didn't have all those guns back in those days, we'd probably still be a British colony right now. So, if you can imagine having your First Amendment right infringed, freedom of speech, where does it stop? Because if you start to take the Second Amendment away, then you can just take anything else away. A common argument that people make is that the First Amendment is much more applicable in today's society because you have the media. It's a basic right to be able to freely express yourself. So if that's the First Amendment, the very next thing the Founding Fathers thought of was to own guns, because they knew that in the future there may be a time when American citizens would have to defend themselves from foreign invaders. And a lot of people think that's kind of a ridiculous idea in America, because why would we ever get invaded? Well, think about how many guns are owned in America. I think there's about over 300 million guns in America, which is roughly close to one per person, but it's only a certain amount of the population that actually own them. So that's why it's nearly impossible for America to ever be invaded, is because of so much gun ownership. Now, if you imagine the rest of your Bill of Rights being infringed, your right to a speedy trial, what if police were allowed to arrest you and throw you in a jail cell for 20 years and never get to your trial, and then it came out that you were innocent? Or what if any number of other things, no search warrants, no self-incrimination? It is absurd to try to exclude the Second Amendment from the Bill of Rights, but still say that everything else is still relevant. Everything that was put in there is still relevant to this day. That's what's allowed the United States Constitution to last so long. Very few other countries ever have anything like that. So, gun control is a failed policy. This is kind of the first step in removing the Second Amendment from modern America. Politicians put a sugar coating over it to make it seem like as long as you ban guns, then crime will be reduced. However, the very principle of gun control only applies to criminals. Law-abiding citizens, it only applies to the law-abiding citizens. Criminals are going to get guns no matter what they want. They're criminals. They don't follow the law. Gun control is going to restrict a normal person's rights. Criminals disregard these laws. That's why they're criminals. Once you disarm the law-abiding citizens, and the criminals are just going to run rampant and basically do whatever they want. And in 1993, there was a string of murders that occurred in Florida just outside of an airport, and teenagers were actually stalking people coming off of foreign flights, and they would go down and they would just shoot them. They were just murderers, and that's plain and simple. And they would go to these flights that were coming from foreign countries because they knew people weren't going to be able to bring guns from foreign countries. It's very difficult to even fly with a gun, and this was pre-9/11, so it was a little bit more lenient. But even still, you couldn't just exactly walk onto an airplane with a gun in your pocket. So they would go to these foreign terminals and follow the people out because they absolutely knew that there was no way that they were going to be able to have a gun. And it just shows that criminals go to these lengths to try to think of these things when they're selecting targets. So if gun control is enacted and nobody has a gun, then you can think of this situation being expanded on a national level. So when gun control policies are in effect, situations occur like happened to Susanna Gratia, and she was a citizen of Texas. This also happened back in the early 90s, and she was having lunch with her parents, and a guy drove his truck through the window of the restaurant there and got out and just started shooting. Well, because of the laws at the time, she had a gun in her car, but she was not allowed to actually carry it on her. And it surprises most people considering this was in Texas, but she had to leave her gun in her car, and this guy drove his car in there and started shooting people. Well, she had no way of defending herself. If she had been able to have that gun with her at the time, she could have prevented all these people from dying. Her father, a World War II veteran, jumped up and lunged at the attacker, and he was shot in the chest and killed instantly. And her mother went over and tried to comfort her father, and she became the next target. So she had to watch this happen right in front of her with her gun in her car 10 yards away because she wasn't allowed to actually carry it. Well, she's actually a Texas state lawmaker now and has actually helped pass some legislation that moves towards the more pro-Second Amendment. Now, when you are allowed to carry a gun, laws have kind of become more and more lenient across the country in some places, with the exception of states like New York and California, of course, and Illinois. But there's a Florida state criminologist by the name of Gary Kleck who does these kinds of studies, and he's found that guns are used defensively as many as 2.45 million times per year. And now a big argument against carrying guns and just the Second Amendment in general is that the pros don't outweigh the cons. There's not enough people that use them the right way or defensively to justify allowing everybody to carry one. Well, this obviously debunks that. 2.45 million lives are potentially saved each year by allowing people to carry guns. This study measured actual confrontations. It left out cases where someone investigated a suspicious activity that turned out to be nothing. So this is actual gun uses. So to wrap everything up, highlight some basic points. Second Amendment is relevant today as it is in any other Bill of Rights amendment or any other amendment to the Constitution. If the government was allowed to restrict the Second Amendment, then what's to stop them from restricting our freedom of speech, freedom of press, religion, petition, anything like that? Once you give them a little bit of ground, they'll take whatever they want. Criminals are going to get guns no matter what you do, so there's no sense in trying to remove a law-abiding citizen's ability from owning one. Susanna Gratia, like I said, she had to watch her parents get gunned down because her car had to be left in her car just a few yards away, so there was just nothing she could do about it. And as many as 2.45 million times a year, guns are used to protect law-abiding citizens, which far outweighs the cons. And that concludes my presentation.